Now, today, in this lecture, I want to talk to you about the discovery of another attention disorder that is mistakenly being called ADHD, but which in many ways is markedly different from this disorder, and I think going to require a different approach to treatment than the kind of thing that we do for ADHD youth. So I'll bring you up to speed as best as I can. There was a whole special issue of a journal this month devoted to this disorder and this topic, and the literature is beginning to grow considerably about it and the many differences that exist between these two groups of individuals. Undoubtedly, you see these people in your practice, in your counseling, in your university or high school setting. You may have been calling them ADD or inattentive ADHD, but the research term, which I do not like, by the way, is sluggish cognitive tempo, and we are in the midst of trying to change that name even within the research journals. I'll have more to say about that in a moment. Hyperfocusing is what we see in autism, where you focus too much on details. What you see in ADHD is perseveration, and that's a better term for it. Perseveration is a symptom of a frontal lobe injury. It means that you continue to persist at tasks that you should have shifted away from to get something else done. But you stayed the course. There you are, playing Warcraft as the bus is coming down the street to pick you up. Now, you can call that hyper-focusing on Warcraft, but the fact is you're perseverating in a highly reinforcing activity when you should have shifted away from that activity. The inability to shift across activities, which is perseverative, is a symptom of ADHD and of a frontal lobe disorder. So I don't like the term hyperfocusing. I know Ned Hallowell uses it. I've heard Pat use it before. But technically, it's not correct scientifically to be using that term. Whereas SCT is a focusing disorder. But instead of over-focusing, they don't focus enough. They can't quickly get to what's important in the information they're processing. We do find that school is a major problem for these individuals. They are as impaired academically as our ADHD individuals, which is hard for people to believe because ADHD is so impairing, but SCT is equally as disruptive to education. And parents have this as their singular concern. So when this child comes in for referral, the parents aren't concerned about, oh my God, he's up all night, he's tearing around the neighborhood, he won't sit still, he's taking risks, he's hitting other kids, I can't get him to listen to story time. We don't hear the distractibility in the teens or the young adults. Instead, what we hear from these people is he's failing. Does he have a learning disability? Why is he struggling so much in school? He's a nice kid. He's very compliant, he's in the band, he's got a few friends, he's a little quiet. But God, getting homework out of this kid is torture. But he's nice, right? A nice kid who does nothing. And you know what we do with those people? We socially promote them. And as a result, children with SCT are later to be referred than ADHD children. They will go on failing longer than ADHD children will because they're nice, right? They're not disruptive. So you may see SCT kids coming to you through a different referral route. They tend to come in through LD programs, educational programs, tutoring programs, and through developmental pediatrics. You're a lot less likely to see them coming into a psychiatry department because that's where people who are a pain in the ass go. But if you're just failing at school, people aren't as likely to call the psychiatrist on you, right? So if you're looking for these people, you may find them elsewhere, like LD programs, including LD universities. So school failure is a big problem for these individuals. Now, when we look at their schoolwork, and I want to emphasize again, there's not a great deal of evidence that's been accumulated here, but it's painting a rather interesting pattern so far. ADHD is a problem with production, amount of work done in unit time. Accuracy is far less a problem for people with ADHD. When they do their work, it's about 85% correct, which is only 9% below normal. For normal kids, it's about 94% correct. So it's not a major difference here, which is why when you give medication to ADHD individuals, their accuracy doesn't go up very much because it wasn't the problem. What goes up markedly is production. They're finally doing something, right? So the problem with ADHD in school is productivity. They don't do any damn work. But if you can pull the work out of them, it's not bad. But it's getting them to sit and produce. So ADHD is a production disorder. SCT is not. It's an accuracy disorder. It's the inverse. And I'm oversimplifying here a little bit to make a point. But here the major problem is mistakes. You get all your work done, and half of it's wrong. You missed the little cues. You didn't see the dot above the line and below the line when subtraction became division. And you just kept doing subtraction. So the second half of your paper is wrong. You fail, right? That's the kind of mistakes we're looking for, these failures in detection, rather than you just didn't do your work. But both will produce impairments. Now, fascinating, we have 3 papers so far that show that both groups are equally as likely to have learning disorders. Is social shyness. SCT children are withdrawn. They're more passive socially. They're a little apprehensive. Some of them are characterized as socially anxious. Shyness might be a better term. But withdrawn is the larger pattern. They're just less engaged with other people socially. Now, I want to be clear. We are not talking about high-functioning autism, schizotypal personality. That's aloofness. They don't value interaction with other people. That's not shyness, right? There's a problem in the social module of the brain that links to autistic spectrum disorders. These people are fine. There's no oddities or peculiarities. They're quiet. If you read the book 2 years ago, the bestseller, Quiet, this is what we're talking about. They're just less engaging. They don't talk as much as other people. They don't interact as much as other people. What we find is that they have more friends than ADHD children do, but not as many as normal children do. And the same is true with the adults. They have friends, just not as many. Whereas ADHD individuals, by the time they're in second grade, 50 to 70% are utterly rejected and have no close friends. And that pattern continues even into adulthood, where their friendships have very short durations. There's a lot of turnover in the relationships of people with ADHD, and we don't see that here. We just don't see them having quite as many friends. They're not the social butterflies. So we have a problem with social withdrawal that is very characteristic and even disabling of some of these individuals. Now, here is the rating scale for children. We assess 15 domains of functioning here, and you can see the groups again, the 4 groups that we split the kids into. Once again, I call your attention to the more obvious pattern. If you get both of these disorders, you are markedly impaired. Now, why is that important? Because they're additive. And if they're the same disorder, they wouldn't be. People with both disorders should be no worse than people with ADHD, because after all, it's ADHD. But when people with both disorders are worse than people with one or the other, it's an additivity effect. And that tells us there's something unique about SCT that is not just ADHD under another name. There's something different about this disorder. And if you have both disorders, you're in trouble. Again, we found SCT was very impairing in educational settings and more impairing in work than ADHD. That was a shocker. Adults with SCT reported that they were markedly more impaired than the adults with ADHD did. Now, here again, this is the executive function rating scale, and it looks as if SCT people might have some executive deficits until you remove the overlap with ADHD, and then it disappears. So once more, ADHD is the executive disorder. SCT is not. Now, this is the impairment rating scale that we gave to these adults. And here you see what we found with children, additivity. If you have both disorders, you're in big trouble. If you have ADHD, you're the second most impaired group. SCT was the third most impaired, except you see the asterisks? Those are the domains in which SCT was worse than ADHD in adults. Work, education, and sex. Sexual relations and sexual activity with others was indicated to be quite impaired, actually. by this disorder. That was a bit of a surprise. I was all sort of scratching our heads. What is this disorder doing? So one night over dinner, I was telling my wife about these results, and she laughed and she goes, "If we are being intimate and you space out, you are dead. That's toast. Game over." I mean, you can imagine trying to be intimate with somebody who's... I mean, it's almost the inverse of intimacy. So consequently, I think that may be the reason. Well, I don't know. It's just a very, very strange finding, not just education and work. All right, so what the heck is going wrong? What might be the cause of SCT? I'm going to start out by saying we're not sure. But we now have several studies, the first of which is the first study of heritability published last week. A giant twin study done in Europe assessed SCT along with ADHD. So here's what the studies are indicating. We don't have any neuroimaging studies yet, but I know 3 are underway. 2 in California, 1 in Brazil. So we're going to have the answer to that here very shortly. But what we can say is if we look at the SCT symptoms, they're more linked to children with leukemia or other brain injuries. This is the attention disorder that is linked to fetal alcohol syndrome. Everybody thought it was ADHD. It isn't. It's this is more linked to fetal alcohol syndrome. Explaining, by the way, why if you give stimulants to these 2 groups of inattentive children, they don't work very well. Stimulants are not very effective at dealing with the inattention in children who have leukemia and survive it, or children who may have had fetal alcohol syndrome or other brain injuries. So it's kind of interesting to see that, at least to a scientist like myself. And the study found that the environment, unique environmental effects, were larger in SCT. Now, unique environment simply means this: something that happened to you and not to anybody else in your family. Shared environment are things that happen to you and other people in your family. How you were raised, the diet that you had at home, how much TV, where you grew up, the schools you went to, the size of the house, the resources of your family. These are shared across siblings. Unique environment refers to things you don't share with your siblings. You fell down a flight of stairs. You got H-flu meningitis. Mom smoked like a chimney during your pregnancy, but not during the others. Those are unique effects. And notice, by the way, they can be biological effects. Environment here doesn't mean social. It can also mean biological, toxic effects. All of this is to say that there may be environmental contributions to SCT more than even to ADHD, but they probably fall in the realm of biology. Okay, SCT was also linked to a greater family history of adversity, as I pointed out earlier. Right? So is PTSD. So might some SCT symptoms be driven to some extent by social stress, turmoil, so on? Maybe. Could possibly be. We don't know. The most fascinating explanation for the nature of SCT, however, is the last line. We've been toying around with, is SCT a disorder of the brainstem? You're just not aroused as much? Doesn't look that way. Is SCT possibly a hypersomnia? We already have the answer to that last week. Overlaps with it, not perfectly explained by it. So, is SCT a problem with the focus element of attention? Probably, but that doesn't completely explain everything that we're seeing here. This one is absolutely fascinating. Pathological mind wandering. So allow me to explain to you what mind wandering is, because it has a very extensive literature in psychology. Mind wandering is where you are doing a task that doesn't command a lot of executive functioning, driving to work. It's a goal-directed task, but it's overlearned and it's primary, and most of it's being done by your automatic brain. Right? So what do? You've got all this excess executive capacity that you've been blessed with. You start to multitask, don't you? So you start to think about your schedule, your day, your appointments, what happened at home, the argument with your wife or your teenager, and you need to get the car inspected. You got all these kinds of things going through your mind while you're driving. We all do that. It is a very efficient use of your executive system to allocate it to a second problem when you're doing a primary task until you forget to turn into the parking lot. And then the secondary task interfered with the primary task. Now, we all do that occasionally. What if you do that every day on every task? The secondary task interferes with the primary task consistently. That's pathological mind wandering. There's a beautiful description of cases of pathological mind wandering, by the way, in Scientific American Mind. Scientific American publishes a separate magazine on psychology called Mind. And 2 years ago, in the 2011, I think it was, edition, you will read beautiful cases of pathological mind wandering in their description. So if you're interested, that is a very good place to go have a look about what do these cases look like. In any case, pathological mind wandering is where there's nothing wrong with your executive system other than that you keep allocating it to other issues. And it's always interfering with what you're supposed to be doing, right? Which is just another way for daydreaming. Every time you're asked to do something, your mind wanders to something else. Now, what's interesting about mind wandering that you might not know is when we all engage in mind wandering, it tends to be negatively biased. Are we as likely to think of the good things or the bad things? If you're driving to work, are you more likely to think about unresolved issues, problems, conflicts, things yet to be dealt with? The answer is yes. More than successes, achievements, things that you were able to accomplish quite effectively. Your executive system is a problem-solving system, so it tends to drift more to what are your existing problems, which means it has a negative bias, which means pathological mind wandering is correlated with depression. The more mind wandering you do, the greater the risk of depression, dysthymia, demoralization. And what do we see in SCT? A higher risk for depression. So even though we cannot today definitively say that SCT is pathological mind wandering, it's a very enticing conceptualization for this condition, but we don't know yet. There are tasks that you can do in a lab to study that, and nobody's done it. So that's a dissertation. Let's talk about the implications of SCT for treatment, and then we can take some more questions if you like. What would we expect to see in SCT? Well, we only have a handful of studies of treatment. They're all done with children. None have been done yet with adults. But given what we know today about the disorder, we can infer some issues around treatment. First of all, studies that have used stimulants with people who are only inattentive, who are highly likely to have SCT, find that they don't work very well. They're very disappointing. They don't hurt you, but they don't help you. So if you give methylphenidate or Concerta or one of the delivery systems to somebody with SCT, you're probably not going to get a very good response. You're not going to hurt them. Go ahead and try it. What we found in our study of children is 1 in 5 responded. If they were going to respond at all, it was at the starting dose, the mild dose. Whereas ADHD, you got to push the dose up. And we found that the more we push the dose up, the less likely they were to respond. An inverse dose effect. But only 1 in 5 of the kids was kept on their medication after the trial. 92% of people with ADHD respond to one of the medications on the market today. That's a marked difference in drug response. And while I can't guarantee that that will replicate in the adults, the pattern suggests that SCT is not really the disorder for stimulants, like methylphenidate, dexedrine, those sorts of things. Before I go to questions, I want to revisit the label. We started using this in our psychiatry clinics with families, and families love the information and hate the name. They find it offensive, derogatory, demeaning. Sounds like slow-witted, stupid, slow learner, mentally retarded, and all the old pejorative phrases. So we, in the past year, my residents and I were sort of casting around for what else could we call this without being misleading. One person has suggested, well, how about primary vigilance disorder? It's an interesting name. It's been used in the literature before, but it implies you know what's happened cognitively, and we don't. So I don't want to use a misleading one. Some people say, well, let's go back and use ADD for this group. That's what clinicians are calling these people. That's not a good idea because ADD was the name for ADHD in the 1980s up through 1987. So do you really want to create that kind of confusion Among people, I don't think so. So the name we came up with, which I think works very well for the time being, is concentration deficit disorder, CDD. It gives no offense. It is not pejorative. Doesn't suggest anything about stupidity or slow-wittedness. It keeps the focus in the area of attention, but it uses a different name from ADHD. After all, if you look up the definition of concentration, it means to focus your attention selectively on some things over others. See, ADHD doesn't involve the word concentration. It involves the term sustained attention, persistence. That's the problem. So, concentration deficit disorder also implies you could have both disorders. They're both attention disorders. They might well overlap, which they do in the population. So I think this solves a number of our problems. It doesn't imply a known cognitive impairment when we don't quite know what it is, and it's not offensive to people, and it's not been used before. So CDD might be a better term, and that's being picked up now among my colleagues. Let me ask you, what do you think about that? Do you prefer SCT or not? No. CDD, yeah, okay, good. A nice generic, non-specific attention problem, right? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe. You know, on the one hand, you hate to see that. On the other hand, that's not a bad thing, because if you were in public health, you would want the public learning about another disorder. Yeah. So what happened with ADHD is, in 1991, when Hallowell wrote Driven to Distraction, adult ADHD hit the planet. And by the way, we had been studying adult ADHD since 1976. Nobody gave a damn until that book became a bestseller. So, the point is well taken. Did that lead to overdiagnosis and too many people thinking they had the disorder and self-diagnosing? A little bit, but overall it was a good thing. Increased public awareness is a good thing. So maybe that will happen with this disorder. Yes, ma'am. Well, as I said, we found a little bit of memory problem linking to SCT. It was mainly in verbal working memory, what you might call short-term memory. They had a little trouble holding things in mind. But again, you have to stop and ask yourself, if this is a mind-wandering problem, then the problem they have isn't with working memory. It's the fact that they're using their working memory to think about other things. Forgetfulness tracks more with ADHD than with this disorder. Now, parents will tell you this kid doesn't get his work done, but it isn't because he knew to do it and forgot to do it. This is a kid who isn't even concentrating on what you're saying. He's just not there. So you'll say something and, Steve, did you hear me? I said, it's time to get your work done. Earth to Steve, hello in there. And you'll see them shake their head. And, oh, were you talking to me? Right. So it's that kind of, it's almost like they have trouble prioritizing what they're thinking about, and they're just not connected to the world around them quite to the degree that they should be. Some kind of disengagement from external events, but I'm not sure. I mean, you could get forgetfulness from that, but once again, we come back to the issue of, is it primary or secondary? And I don't know. Absolutely fascinating.
Okay, but it doesn't, can I mistake? I can't.
No. You're going to have to go over and probably use an ADHD diagnosis, inattentive presentation, parentheses, right, SCT or CDD, and then describe it, because you want to signal to the people getting your report, this is not garden variety ADHD. Okay? You're going to have to play the insurance game of ticking the box for ADHD inattentive. Right, that's right. Because this is not an official diagnosis in a taxonomy yet. Okay, so you guys are way ahead of the curve. You know more than even the DSM people know. So.